I would love to go to earlier days when you started the first, change, transformation of being in this difficult situation, broken, struggling, just going on with life, and then had this opportunity, to get clean and fix your life and start a new path. It sounded all, easy peasy, done that, been there, awesome. Maybe not even taking the first step can be difficult, but maintain and persevere, and when there are bad days, and keep going. I'm curious, what lessons have you learned from those moments where, yes, maybe there has been opportunity, maybe there were good circumstances allowing you to leave that life behind, make decisions to get clean. Maybe the decision to do it was easier or harder, but I can imagine then the day in, day out, staying on this new path was not easy, that there was struggle, there were moments of doubt and questioning and darkness. And I'm curious, for lots of people, we know what we should be doing, we know what is the right path, we often have the knowledge and understanding that this is healthy, this is good, this is how I want my life to be, I want to eat well, I want to exercise, I want to be a decent human being. Knowing is not half the battle. I'm always curious to know what kept you going, what lessons and tools and strategies, and how do you manage to stay on the path to be able to get to the stage of, obviously I'm successful, I've made it, I have family, I have life, I have success, overcoming those early years, this early definement, because the life that you describe, the childhood that you describe, there's lots of conditioning, there's lots of happening in the brain and body and emotions being locked in the body, aside from obviously all the circumstances pushing you then and steering you to stay on this path. So I will shut up and let you take us a little bit more on your journey of how did you manage to persevere and keep going and get out of there.
Thank you, Lenka. I mean, that's a great point, and yeah, I'm really pleased that you started there, because it's a massive challenge, and for me, when I got to that point of surrendering, I really was very unconscious, and I'd always just found a way through everything. I was like a warrior. I'd found a way through everything. And as I said, I mentioned earlier, I touched on my spirit was dying, and I had no knowledge of that. I couldn't say my spirit was dying, but, I wanted to change. I had a child on the way, and I knew that the life I was living, wouldn't serve bringing a family up, wasn't something different. The physical side of addiction, I was using heroin at the time, so I managed under my own will to stop using that. I'd substitute for something else. There was always something there. I didn't have any idea how deep this problem went for me. And eventually, I didn't mention that I'd been through jails and all of that kind of journey of just, refusing to yield to life. Just anything that come to me, I went through it, it bounced off of me. So I developed this whole set of tools of survival. And, to start with, at the beginning, what I realized was everything that I knew, I couldn't trust anymore. All my coping strategies, my mechanisms of getting through life, I knew, I didn't know what was good and what was bad about me. And I realized that by just doing some journaling work. I've done a bit of journaling work. It was in a facility, but, I then saw kind of in black and white the truth of my life, because the reality that I was living in my head was completely different. I'd created this whole reality, I'd stepped into it, I was living in it, and when I actually looked at it with a different lens, with a different perspective, it was terrifying. So that motivated me to go through the change, and the change was, putting down drugs and moving away from drugs. Really wasn't, it was challenging physically, but it really wasn't the issue. What the issue was is, how do I interface with life? I'd created this whole way to interface with life. And I think that was my challenge, my deepest challenge, is to just let go of that. And as a 24-year-old man, You know, I used to wake up in those early days and just have just a big ball of fear in my stomach. And I just used to open my eyes and just, oh, how am I going to do this? How am I going to face the day? Because I was just full of fear, you know. But all of those mechanisms that I built to interface life, they just didn't work for me in changing. So it was an onion, and I didn't even know it was an onion, but I kind of just knew three things that I picked up on. I went to a 12-step fellowship at the time, Narcotics Anonymous, and you know, they was talking this whole different language, which I didn't really understand, but I could see, you know, I could see people that looked happy and looked well, and they was talking about a lot of different things about spirituality, higher powers, you know, all of this stuff. And three things I think which I really thought I can do these three things was to learn some honesty, self-honesty, to learn how to be open-minded and willing. So with those three tools, I started off on this journey of changing. And it was about being honest enough to recognize that the things, how I got my money in the past, that wasn't going to work. You know, that wasn't part of the life. So then I had to be willing to let go of that. So, you know, it was not only getting these tools, it was, you know, putting them into action, learning how to integrate the tools and just use those to move forward with. And really the first year of my sobriety, my daughter was born when I was 4 months clean. And she spent her first year in and out of hospital, her lung collapsed. It was, you know, it was horrendous. And really all I still had, you know, the ability to go through things. You know, I still had that part of me, that belief system, that I just had to go through things. And that belief system kind of got me through a lot of that stuff, you know. And the learning to change was a slow process. But, you know, it was about being consistent with using these tools to start with, you know, looking at myself and questioning myself. And even, you know, the honesty, I'll give you an example of the honesty quickly. You know, I can remember going and talking to a couple of guys in recovery, and, you know, I told them this story that I told 100 times, and, you know, I fully believed it and I'd embellished it along the way. And then as I walked away, I realised that it was nonsense. It was like something I'd made up. You know, there might have been a little bit of truth in the beginning. And then I went back to them and said, you know, that was just a load of rubbish I just told you. It was nonsense. You know, and just, I mean, that's coming from where I come from in the East End, and no one shows any sign of weakness, any feelings. So to step into that level of vulnerability and expose myself was like, you know, they looked at me like I was nuts. And people don't go and do that. I just told you a load of rubbish. You know. But it was part of that process of that honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness, being willing to just, you know, go to an edge and just, you know, try to do something different, to act differently. You know, my thinking was quite often repetitive. It was in these cycles, and it was difficult to get out of my own will of how I should run my life. But the evidence at that time was that, you know, I hadn't run it very well. I was incapable of running my life. You know, that was the truth. It was very destructive to me and everyone around me. So, you know, I understood that, and I understood that I had a deep responsibility that no one else could do for me. That I had to engage with these new tools, these new ways to be in life, and it was terrifying. You know, going up to those guys and saying, "Listen," you know, that was terrifying. That was terrifying. I never felt exposed like that before. You know, if anyone ever come at me, I'd absolutely defend myself to the absolute nth degree. It was just changing all of that stuff. And I think that's a really valuable testament of changing anything, you know, engaging in any different way in life is actually practicing it and learning to integrate it. I mean, that's changed for me. You know, I can think about something, you know, think about it, tell myself stories, and the stories come from my belief systems and conditioning. But until I actually act differently, you know, then I'm moving forward. So that was really the piece that made me different from a lot of other people that was failing.
It's interesting you're talking about this kind of self-honesty, this really being real with ourselves and looking at, what are the truths, half truths, what are the beliefs we have about ourselves, what are the stories we're telling. And I think for lots of people, this is something that we do struggle with. We can be on both ends of the spectrum. We can lie to ourselves that we're the best, that we're doing the best we can, we're the victim, poor little me. Or we can be so hard on ourselves. We can be like, you're the worst, you do not do well, you're ugly, you're fat, you're all those things. And yet when, I love that you mentioned journaling, or when you try to put down the facts, when you put down the reality, when you start looking at it from fine and objectivity, is it true, is it not, is it my feeling, then we start peeling these layers of the onion and start realizing, okay, what is the reality, what are the stories, what is the conditioning, because we know that we create our reality. Our brain will believe whatever we tell it to. If we repeat it long enough, frequently enough, the brain will, okay, this is the truth, you keep telling me this, you keep thinking this, you keep acting this, so this is my truth, and this is how I then am going to be prompting you, I'm going to be encouraging you, I'm going to be forcing you to think, feel, behave going forward. And I think that then it's interesting that you've already been on this journey of, self-discovery and honesty to get out of the dark places, to get on the path, on new path. And yet then you mentioned that you build yourself up, you have achieved success, you have figured out life in a way, and then you realized again that, who am I? Why am I doing this? Whose life and by which rules am I living? So can you talk us a little bit through then this, I would say, second realization, big aha moment, big new journey starting? What was the trigger there? What was the start there? What was the journey again you took from realizing, okay, I'm no longer, struggling with life. I have life figured out. Look at me. And yet I feel like I'm not.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there in that stuff, but I'll try by saying that initially, you spoke about, not knowing how to take care of ourselves and being too hard on ourselves. And, we're speaking generally because a lot of people had that problem, but I had that problem. I was like, I thought it was, I had to figure everything out, and everything was down to me. And I had this real deep need coming from my childhood to control everything. I mean, I won't go right back to childhood, but I assume that, in my childhood where I was, the only thing that I could control was what was within me. I had no external control over, being a victim and that kind of stuff. So I built these systems, and, I think that the pivot for me of moving through all of that stuff, I was gradually peeling back layers of an onion through that, and I learned, because I lived in shadow. My whole life was really spent in shadow, and all the tools that I used were on the shadow side of myself. So I really had to start develop, compassion and just empathy and stuff like that for other people, which I did start doing, and then introduce that into my life and introduce that into my business, and and like those tools that I mentioned, just started using this stuff and putting it out. And it's funny that you say, we don't know how to really be kind to ourselves and find a balance on that, even when we're moving forward. And I'll speak for me because I can't speak for anyone else, but I was 24 years into my recovery. I've become that successful person that I spoke to, and I was taking care of everyone. I was taking care of everyone. My two elder children had moved out by then. I put them in flats that I'd owned because I got into property, and I was like a real entrepreneur. And I was taking care of everybody and all the staff, treating all the staff as I'd like to be treated myself, as an equal, whether they was working as a cleaner for 2 hours a day or whether they was a manager or running like an office refurb or something like that. I treated everyone as an equal, and I learned to do all that to other people, but I couldn't do it to myself. I went through a process during my recovery, a men's process of making a list of everyone I could think about that I'd harmed or done, done some harm to. And there were so many people that I'd never be able to make an amends to. And so I went through this list and wrote this whole list of, and it went right back to childhood, to someone that I'd upset at school just for a bit of kudos or something like that. A real in-depth look at myself. And it's interesting that I was never on that list. I never put myself on that list that I needed to amend myself. So it showed you then 24 years into recovery, into, living this life. I didn't know how to look after myself. And I think that was what was missing for me. The relationship I was in, 26 years, we've been married. It hadn't been working for quite a while, but, I had a belief system that I had to keep everything together. I come from a place of maternal abandonment. My dad wasn't really there. So, I had this deep belief system that, it doesn't matter what, I'll keep all this together. This is, I'm going to do something different than what I experienced. But in that belief system, there was no room for recognizing my needs in there. And what happened over a period of time was, I realized that my marriage was, as much as I tried and we tried to resolve things, it was just like I was pouring everything into just an abyss, really, and nothing was coming back. And I was so used to in life of being self-contained and just not needing anyone or anything, So I had that in my thought, and I just started to recognize, about me. That voice started coming in. Who looks after me? I'm looking after all of these people. And and it was a real moment of wow, who looks after me? And of course there was no one to look after me because I didn't even know who I was. I just created these roles. So the pivot for me was one day it wasn't preemptive. It wasn't. I woke up one morning in this beautiful house that I lived in, and went out, done some gardening, and took my wife up a cup of tea. And was sitting there. It was a beautiful day. I was looking over the sea, from the balcony, and I just these words come out. I just said, "It's beautiful out there, isn't it?" And she went, "Yeah, it is. I'm not going to be here." That's my sensitivity. It's something that I've had to go back and claim. And it's still a sensitive moment for me because it was the hardest choice that I'd ever made in my life. To let go of that. But the hardest choice for me, and I just said, look, I'm here. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be here to enjoy this with you. And I walked away from that life with a bag. And just went into a spiral of just, I didn't know what was happening really. I just went on this journey of deep change, and the first thing that I felt was loss. That's what just came up then. Was loss, and it was a lifetime of loss of stuff that I'd never acknowledged, never felt, never allowed in. It was like that moment was a catalyst for this whole well of feelings to come up, and I quickly shut it off because I was, I didn't know how to be with any of that stuff. And I realized that I was in trouble as well, because with that loss, what came up with that loss was a self-destructive element that I'd kind of put to bed really, because I was in this safe bubble of how I was living, and but that self-destruction come up as well. And I started being in my place. I moved into a little place and trying to do some writing, trying to figure out what's going on, figure out what these feelings are. And then the knives would be singing at me, the carving knife would be singing to me like a siren, And it was like I was recognizing that, wow, I've got this real need to change this somehow. I knew that drinking drugs wasn't going to be an option. You know, I'd been clean for so long that I knew that wasn't going to be an option for me. But I just didn't know how to feel. You know, I had to learn how to feel and to connect with my feelings. So that was the big pivot for me. And once I'd kind of done that, I could have very easily gone back, because my wife was like, yeah, you know, come back to this, you've gone mad, you're having a crisis. And I was having a crisis, but the crisis wasn't that, you know, it was a crisis of like, oh, I've come into this life, I've lived, you know, by that time I was 48 years old. I've lived 48 years of it, and I don't even know who I am. That was the crisis. So, you know, I had to learn how to start feeling, and it come in tiny increments, because that's all I could manage. And I'd start feeling, maybe I'd be journaling, and all of a sudden this feeling would come up, this loss. And then it would be like an iron shutter just come down, bang, disappear, like a magician's trick. And I'd just be left like, what is going on? You know, so I went and got a bit of therapy, and you know, this guy basically just kind of held my hand and just tried to keep me safe from all this stuff, because I did feel suicidal for that period. And yeah, it was a really challenging, really difficult period of really discovering who I was, and allowing all this stuff. You know, today I'm happy to show my sensitivity. I'm happy to be vulnerable. You know, these are things that I've worked really hard to reclaim in my life. To reclaim that part of me and integrate them, you know, into who I am. And I'm a warrior still. I am a warrior. I'll always be a warrior. You know, I haven't lost that part. But it's just like integrating these two energies, you know, this masculine and feminine, if you like, this vulnerability, this sensitivity, this ability to just be me, and to know that I'm a warrior and I'm strong, and, you know, I still haven't lost all of that stuff. I've just rebalanced it. So it's like, you know, the whole piece of this kind of work that I've been doing for the last 13 years now, 13 to 14 years since that day, has been just integrating and finding, you know, bits of me that don't work and don't serve me. And when I say bits of me, I'm talking about belief systems, I'm talking about all this kind of stuff that you mentioned, Lenka. And yeah, it's so freeing and rewarding. It's opened up so much in my life.